Okay, so today we're talking about sharpening hand planes, and a couple of things to note. When sharpening the back, or I'm sorry, with sharpening, you still need to flatten the back of the plane. Unlike flattening a chisel back, which requires the entire back to be flattened, we only really care about the section in front of this little eye hole to the cutting edge of the blade. This is the area that needs to get flattened. That's it. Anything else is just a waste of time. So from there, this is already being sharpened, so I'm just resharpening this one. I want to touch up the back because with use you're going to get different nicks and various little irregularities into this iron. But once I've done that, this is with my 8,000 stone, so I'm pretty much done. Feeling for any burrs that might be there. That's that. I'm done with re-flattening the back when I'm sharpening. The more important question is going to be, how do we sharpen the bevel of the iron? And this is all for bevel down or hand planes, not block planes. So this came out of my number 3. The bevel will be facing down. This is where I'm going to be running this over the board. Referred to as bevel down, as we see in some planes, the geometry of the frog, or the thing that holds the blade, that's very, very different. And so for those, you would want to bevel up. But for this one, bevel down, this used in conjunction with our chip breaker. As we're dragging this across the material, the chip breaker has this little bevel itself, not sharpened, but those chips start to be forced in an opposite direction, and it helps them to be cut cleanly off of the pass that you're making. So, alright, so flattening the back, easy. The bevel is kind of a different conversation. Traditionally with a bevel down plane, the bevel angle that we want to achieve is 25 degrees. And 25 degrees is easy enough to find. I've got a couple of different honing guides. Let's say I'm starting with the Eclipse version here. So setting this thing up, the bevel always needs to face or be in alignment with where the rolling wheel is. And I could just use a straight edge here, and I can set this up, but to match whatever the bevel angle is doing. But the problem is I'm assuming that the angle is where it should be. If this is not a 25 degree bevel angle, then this method really doesn't work, and you need some other technique or practice to get the correct geometry there. So there's a little block here. It's been listed with planes. This provides the correct projection or geometry with this, and so this is repeatable. This will always give me the correct angle for what it is I'm doing. If you are using the Eclipse style, remember, no matter how strong you are, you're never strong enough to finger tighten this without putting force on this. It's always going to start sliding out of the back of this tool. The question that should come up, or would probably make sense, is I have one of these little blocks for chisels and one for planes. Why do I need both? And simple answer, good question, but simple answer is that we're resting the cutting edge in 2 different locations. You'll notice that the plane iron is set up on the top sections here of this honing guide, whereas when we're doing chisels, unless it's a really wide chisel, I'm talking about 1.5 to 2 inches wide, the chisel mounts slightly lower into this style of honing guide. So because of the different geometry, one is a little bit higher, this is setting up here, chisel's a little bit lower, that requires different projection. So if I'm doing that, oops, I need this, I don't need that. It's easy enough to repeat. If you're using something like Veritas or a different honing guide that clamps between the back of the iron and the, I guess the front by default would make sense. There are sometimes different methods for setting up and repeating that angle, but this one is where we want to be. Sometimes it's preferable to use this style of honing guide with a narrow wheel in comparison with the width of the iron. And there's one simple reason. When you're using a hand plane, you'll notice that the corners of this iron, these two corners tend to, as you're planing over the board, depending on how this is set inside of the plane, these corners can start to find themselves into the board itself, and they can start to get really nasty gouges inside of what it is you're cutting or flattening. Some people deal with those in different ways. I have an example, this one. Not sure if you can quite make this out, but those corners are just a nightmare when you're not expecting it. So I've notched off the corners there and there. And yeah, I still have these sharp little points on my iron. Maybe it's easier to see this way. But it's not as severe, as dramatic as a 90-degree corner that would be resting here or here. Those make nasty little gouges. So I've gotten rid of those. Far less of an issue flattening or using the hand plane when you've done that. A lot of woodworkers, this is a nasty example of a bevel that has all kinds of different angles. I pulled this out of, it looks like my number 3, and I replaced it with a thicker iron. This was the original Stanley iron that came with it. A lot of woodworkers, and I hope you can make out this geometry, they'll create a more curved or a camber in their iron. Same concept exists. By removing these corners, you run the risk of not, or you don't run the risk of grabbing these corners when you're planing. It makes life a little bit easier. I couldn't say that one way is better or the other. One is right, one is wrong. They're just different methods of doing the same thing. So because I'm just resharpening this tool, it's easy enough to, same process exists. I want to sit down that wheel well before or well in advance of introducing the iron. You have a bit of a triangulation happening here because that narrow wheel is in the back and the center, the two extremities here. Just to resharpen, I can do this. That noise that you're hearing is fairly normal while you are having this tool in rest. It's in water, and it starts to scale just a little bit, get a little oxidation. So it'll break loose. Be very sure and fight the temptation to lubricate this with anything at all. Anything that is non-water based or soluble will start to mix with your water, could embed itself into your stone. Then it wouldn't allow water to come and lubricate the stone as you're sharpening. So anyway, sharpening here and here. I'm keeping my fingers fairly wide in the process, and with a narrow wheel in the center here, this allows me to cheat a little bit to the right and to the left, and I can start to, with this honing guide, start to create that camber onto this this iron that way. And some people swear by it, that's great. I think with this honing guide you can definitely get in and do that. It's something that I would encourage you to explore and figure out what is the best method for sharpening. And it looks like I'm pretty close here. Okay, yeah, I've gotten rid of the nicks. So when you're resharpening, life is much easier. This is your first time. Being sensitive to these things is critical. Okay, so a couple of other conversations that have come up with sharpening the plane irons. People talk a lot about something called back beveling, and back beveling is a process by which back beveling, is when you put a slight angle on the back of the iron here, and that allows for you to do less sharpening because all you really care about is this first 1/8 of an inch, maybe less, of contact area. So when you are setting this tool or this iron back into the tool, your chip breaker will clamp and pinch just on that area that you flattened. So in other words, instead of flattening the entirety of the back leading up to this little eye hole, with back beveling, you create less surface area, or I'm sorry, you create less surface that you need to flatten, but just enough to engage when this chip breaker is clamped in. And this is very, very protected. This is a very hard conversation to get into because people take this stuff very, very seriously as far as right way or wrong way. I personally don't love the back beveling option. By doing it, I feel like I'm removing more of the thickness of the iron, and we're talking about microscopic amounts. We're not talking about losing half of the thickness of this thing, but it's enough to at least be aware of. So let's say you do want to do it. It's going to be difficult to lay the back of your chisel here and start flattening this way, because you'll need to elevate this up so that you're only making contact right on the tip of where that iron is going to cut. So this is a very thin piece of steel, and I would say it's less than 1/16 of an inch. So by doing this, I can drag this across back and forth. This elevates the iron and it presents the right angle for me to introduce a back bevel. And that's an easy way to do it. I just do this back and forth until I see. Then I'm starting to remove this material. And so, so by doing this, then I've created a back bevel. And you'll just do this until it widens up enough for the chip breaker to engage. Alright, so that is another option for sharpening. For me, I'm pretty boring when it comes to flattening or sharpening these things. So I want this, the back of the iron, to be nice and flat, introduce a nice honing edge or honed edge. The other conversation that people have often is about a micro bevel on the bevel here, so a secondary angle. And I've tried it. I don't know that I've experienced a lot to be gained by that. The real issue with doing a micro bevel or a secondary bevel on a plain iron is that you start to change the geometry pretty rapidly. So the frog is set at a standard angle here. You can buy these at different geometry depending on what it is you're cutting and the operations you're doing with them. But this is set up, and with a 25-degree bevel here, it cuts at exactly 45 degrees from the sole of the plane. And that's important because it gives you the most benefit of cut, the least amount of resistance. If I were to put this lower, I would get so much less resistance with this, make a finer cut potentially, but I'm not getting as much material as potentially. And conversely, if I start going up, I'm getting less of a cut. This is more of a shearing situation, and it's better for highly figured materials. It could be beneficial for lots of reasons. I say all of this because if I have 25 degrees here across the bevel and I introduce a secondary bevel, I now lose a lot of what this plane is designed to do and cutting at that 45 degrees. As I said, I've tried it. I just don't know that there's enough benefit to putting a secondary bevel on this to encourage everybody to try it. But that's the history of it. And so most of my planes, for most of the operations that I'm doing, will be right at that 25 degrees, and I just work up through the grits. So starting with my lowest grit, ending at about an 8,000, that should be plenty. There are some really amazing videos for really well-respected woodworkers who take an iron right out of the box and they do this thing freehand, and they have a pretty steep secondary bevel. Don't worry about the primary bevel, don't worry about flattening the back, and they do this and they get beautiful shavings in a couple of minutes right out of the box. I would encourage you to try those type of methods, but this represents kind of the traditional rationale and thinking for getting into sharpening irons. Okay, good luck. Let me know in the comments what you think.